This is Mr. Bob. He is a new teacher at Cherry Primary School. Mr. Bob was told that the school has a positive attitude to inclusion and adheres to Heidel's 2014 definition of inclusion as being participation in every aspect of daily life. During the first week of teaching at Cherry, Mr. Bob begins to have concerns about some of the potentially exclusionary practices he observes, some of which he believes can seem contrary to Foreman's 2011 definition, requiring acceptance of all students no matter their differences. This is Diggy. He is one of the students that Mr. Bob believes could be experiencing some exclusionary practices. Mr. Bob was told by Diggy's previous year's teacher, Diggy probably has an undiagnosed autism spectrum disorder. This immediately raised issues for Mr. Bob related to deficit thinking. Harry and Klingler, 2007, describe scenarios where teachers define potential differences in students through disability as not acceptable. In opposition to this, Florian and Black-Hawkins, 2011, propose viewing student differences as natural variations to be embraced, not corrected. Diggy is often removed from the classroom for additional support to, as Bank Mickelson 1980 would call it, normalise him. Mr. Bob has issues with this practice and questions, as Foreman and Arthur Kelly would, 2015, what is the supposed normal we are trying to get students to achieve? Mr. Bob approaches Miss Jill, the school's assistant principal and the intervention program lead, and questions the need to exclude Diggy and others like him from the class to support his reading development. Miss Jill cites the neoliberalist driver identified by Candico, 2010, of having to remove costs wherever possible from the public school system, and the impacts that this type of pressure has on the availability of in-class teaching assistant support. Jill states that from a cost-benefit point of view, current practice is deemed the most effective. In frustration, Mr. Bob, citing Osterman 2000, raises the potential impacts that this type of exclusionary practice could have on students like Diggy. He states that any practice that excluded or ignored them leads to often intense feelings of anxiety, depression, and grief. Mr. Bob reiterates this by citing Colligan, 2013, who writes that this practice can have long-term negative impacts on students' self-worth. Bob highlights the fact that Diggy is always resistant whenever he is asked to go to the intervention room. Jill sees this as an issue too. Bob wonders aloud whether this reticence is because Diggy is being identified as less able than his peers. Together, Mr. Bob and Miss Jill agree that Mr. Bob can try a different pedagogical approach in his classroom. Bob will resist all deficit discourse and adopt tasks that Florian and Black-Hawkins 2011 describe as respecting the dignity of all learners. Mr. Bob intends to achieve this by implementing pedagogies that differentiate by offering choice of task and depth of task investigation. After some research, Mr. Bob brings 4 potential pedagogical approaches that he has identified as having potential to bring all learners back into his classroom. Diggy and the other students will no longer be required to leave the classroom, a practice Florian et al. Describe as exclusionary. The considered approaches were two-way learning, learning through collaboration and cultural interaction from Living Knowledge 2008, cooperative learning, small group work on shared goals from Gillies and Boyle, no date, negotiated curriculum, student-led co-curricular development with focus on student interest, Dowden, no date. The pedagogy agreed upon by Miss Jill and Mr. Bob was inquiry learning. Murdoch, no date, describes this pedagogy as leveraging students' desire for knowledge to work at deeper levels. Students will wonder, plan, and synthesize what they want to know as a group. Mr. Bob explains to Miss Jill that he will use Humphrey's 2013 3 protective approaches to creating an inclusive classroom. Protective, commit to protecting students from themselves, other students, and even teachers. Preventative, avoid or remediate potential disruptions in the classroom that could derail learning or calmness and affect the students. Augmentative, provide as much authentic experience that will serve to grow students' sense of self-worth. Miss Jill now realises that the school has some way to go in its goal of being fully inclusive for all students. Miss Jill is now aware that some of the practices used by the school, with the best of intentions, have denied students the feeling of full inclusion. The Australian Institute of Family Studies 2011 views any barrier that restricts someone from engaging with their community fully, in this case school, as will be exclusionary practice. Miss Jill and Mr. Bob committed to monitoring the progress and success of all students in Mr. Bob's classroom under the new pedagogical approaches.